G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Today we are giving you number 22 when it comes to the top 25 most interesting fantasy basketball players, and it is the big man who has found himself in Utah, John Collins. Let's go!
Jordan open, Chicago with the lead! Bryant to Shaq!
Not a game. We talking about practice.
LeBron James with no regard for human life.
Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Bang!
Curry for three. Wow! Unbelievable. Making it rain in New York.
We the North are now we the champions.
Not the destination, it's the journey. Mamba out.
G'day and welcome again to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter at Ball Boys Fantasy. And today we are coming to you talking about number 22 in the Ball Boys top 25 most interesting, most fascinating, and potentially the most influential basketball or fantasy basketball players this season. And at number 22, I've got the big man, John Collins, who has moved from Atlanta to the Utah Jazz this season, who is a very interesting case, I think, this season. Maybe flying a little bit under the radar in a lot of fantasy basketball drafts because obviously he was fairly underwhelming last season, and he also provides a somewhat boring fantasy stat set in the fact that he's not super high in assists, steals, blocks, threes. He's just kind of one of those steady, good rebounds, points, field goal percentage, solid free throws across the board kind of guys. So it is interesting to see him fall far down, and we're going to talk about him in a lot of detail today, guys, going deep diving into what I think he should be doing this season and where I think he should be going in drafts and what potential value could he bring us back this season. So we're going to go ahead and do that one. Before we start, guys, if you are watching along, please give this video a big thumbs up if you are enjoying all the fantasy basketball content. There's going to be so much content coming out in these next 3 weeks leading up to the start of the season. And a reminder, guys, if you haven't already, go over to ballboysnba.com and grab yourself a season guide. You can get either a silver or platinum membership over there, guys. And by now, hopefully, unless I've really slacked off this afternoon, you guys should be able to see my Dynasty rankings over there if you are a Platinum membership member as well, subscriber as well. So go and check those ones out if you haven't already. Very interested to see your thoughts there, guys. Feel free to email me or DM me or tweet at me your thoughts and anything that you maybe agree or disagree with or just find interesting. Always happy to talk fantasy hoops. But let's talk Johnny Collins. Now, John Collins is a very interesting player because he is still right in the middle of, if not just entering the prime of his career. And for a player who is someone who we consider who has been falling the last couple of seasons, kind of similar to like DeAndre Ayton, he peaked in his fantasy value very early in his career. In 2019-20, he was actually a top 10 fantasy player for the season. Now, he did that on limited games in 41 games on that season after having an injury earlier on in the year, but coming back and playing extremely well. That was in his third NBA season. He's had 3 top 50 fantasy basketball seasons, 2 of them of which in the last 3 seasons. And his last season, he was ranked 103rd for 9 category rankings. He's 25.5 years old. In -1 rankings, he was the 123rd player last year. And in Yahoo points, he was the 125th year. So by all accounts, last season for John Collins was the worst of his career when it came to fantasy projections and fantasy scoring. And the only one since his rookie season that he was outside the top 50 for 9 category rankings. Now, I do think it is important to note that he is probably a better player in a 9 category ranking setting because he is a guy that has low turnovers and he is pretty consistent across the board. His -1 ranking isn't quite as high as his 9 cat ranking, I think, for the boost of the turnovers and also the fact that he's not completely, his rankings isn't held back by one particular hugely low value stat like a free throw percentage or a field goal percentage or anything like that. But he is still someone that I think is getting a little bit undervalued based on just what he did last season. And when we look further back, he is someone that You don't have to look 2 years ago and he was a top 50 player. And when he is, as we look at these ADPs, going very, very close to the 100th pick on Yahoo, his ADP is 104. Fantrax, his ADP is 99.6. And ESPN, the good old ESPNers, they're drafting him a little bit earlier at 84.4. So for most of us, we're able to get him in the 90s, sometimes in the hundreds, and a player who has been a top 50 guy for 4 out of his 6 seasons in the NBA, and still as a young player. I think that there's a little bit of value to that. So let's have a deep dive into what happened with John Collins last year. So if we look at the 2022-2023 averages, they're pretty underwhelming. Obviously, 105th ranked player or whatever it was last season, 13 points, 1 3, 6.5 rebounds, 1.2 assists, 0.6 steals. He averaged a block per game, nearly 51% from the field and 80% from the free throw line. He also had a career low 17% usage for the season. So that is definitely something to note. What I've done on the screen here as well for people watching along on YouTube, you can see his previous 2 seasons. I've just combined the previous 2 years. In those years, he was the 49th and the 46th ranked player. So very similar years in terms of his fantasy impact. For those 2 seasons combined, he averaged 16.9 points per game, 1.3 threes, 7.6 rebounds, 1.5 assists, 0.6 steals, 1 block, 54% from the field, and 81% from the free throw line on a usage rate of 21%. So the main differences I think that we can really come away from these comparisons is that obviously the assists and steals are pretty much the same. That hasn't changed. The blocks, he still averaged 1 block per game across the entire 3 seasons. 3 years in a row, he's averaged 1 block per game. So we feel pretty confident about that. The free throw percentage, around the 80-81% mark, very consistent. We're happy with that. The 2 main things here are the points, which again ties into the usage rate. So the average of 21% versus 17%. And the rebounds. So the rebounds last year were 6.5 rebounds per game versus 7.6 the 2 seasons prior. So he dropped a rebound per game compared to his previous couple of seasons. And also a slight difference in his field goal percentage. So nearly 51% to 54%. So a little bit of a difference there. A lot of people talk about his finger injury and things like that. That might have affected him a little bit in the last 3 months of the season. He was at 51.6%, so slightly better than the 50.8%, but not a huge difference in my opinion. So it's yet to be seen in terms of that field goal percentage, whether he can bring that back up. We shall see. But the main difference I think here that saw his value drop was just the fact that he was just getting fewer shots per game. His usage rate was down. And so I guess the biggest question that we have is going over to Utah, does that have an opportunity to go back up? Is it a better situation for him to get more shots in Utah than it was in Atlanta? So the next screen here that we're going to look at over on YouTube is going to dissect that question. So what I've done here, and this isn't by no means like the most scientific process, but I just thought it was a fun little exercise for myself to do. So I've looked at the rest of the starting 5 in Atlanta for last year, and what I'm projecting to be the starting 5, or the rest of the starting 5 in Utah for this season. And I've just gone based on last season. What were their average field goal attempts for the year or across the season? For certain players, I've manipulated the stats a little bit here. So when we get to Utah, I've taken Walker Kessler's starting numbers. I've also done the same thing for Colin Sexton. When he was a starter, I've taken his numbers there. But for the others, I've done the season because, again, I'm trying to give it a more realistic look for assuming everyone's healthy. And I think Utah was a bit more straightforward. I've just kind of taken their season numbers. So the other thing I've also done here is the field goal attempts are the actual field goal attempts, and I've also taken into account free throw attempts. And for every 2 free throw attempts, I've equated it to 1 field goal attempt. Again, not scientific, not the most accurate data, but it gives us a general idea in terms of how many shots are available on Atlanta versus how many shots are available on Utah with those starting groups. So I hope that makes sense. Again, I know it's not the most scientific and accurate way, but it's just a simplistic way for me to demonstrate it and display it on a single slide on a YouTube video. So in Atlanta, we've had the total amount of shots here, and you can look at it on the screen if you want to break it down player by player, but the total amount of shots for Utah for the starting 5 or starting 4 next to Collins was 65.6 versus Utah, 61.1. So there's a difference of about 4.5 field goal attempts per game there. Now, if I compare the field goal attempts combined from the previous 2 seasons for John Collins when he was a top 50 player, he averaged 12.05 field goal attempts versus last year he averaged 10 field goal attempts. So we actually only really need to find 2 extra field goal attempts per game for John Collins for him to literally rise another, 40 to 50 spots. You combine that with his field goal percentage coming up and his rebounds coming up, and that is literally the difference. It's not much, in my opinion. So as you can see on this field goal attempt comparison, there is those 2 field goal attempts per games available for John Collins to just step in and do his thing. It's actually, there's more field goal attempts available per game for him to do so. Now, so to me, there is plenty of room for that usage rate to come back up. Again, it was the lowest of his career and the lowest of his career by some margin. So last year he was at 17%, but the year before that he was at 20%, 21.8%, 23% the year before that, 23% the year before that as well. And then even in his rookie season, he was at 17.8% usage rate. So I am very comfortable, very confident that his usage rate will get closer up to more towards that 20-21% usage over in Utah because, someone like a Larry Markkinen is not going to post the usage rate of someone like a Trae Young. They're sort of like the comparison of those two being the top big dog guys. Your second guy in Jordan Clarkson versus DeJounte Murray. Again, still a little bit less room there. Kessler and Clint Capella kind of wash each other out. And then Hunter versus a Colin Sexton, again, pretty similar. So I actually think that there is more shots to go around in Utah. I think the talent level in Utah is obviously a little bit lower, and John Collins comes in as a guy who has a better offensive talent compared to some of the other players in Atlanta. So I feel very confident to say that his usage will come back up. And the good thing about John Collins, again, he's a guy who's 51, 52% from the field. The more shot attempts he gets, not only does that add points to his scoring, it also adds volume to his field goal percentage, which is a positive, which is something that will definitely help his value. He's probably going to maybe score an extra 0.1, 0.2 threes per game as well. If we tie that all back into, if you're a guy that believes in the broken finger issue and things like that, if that's feeling better by now, you could maybe say that that helps his field goal percentage. So I do really think that the field goal percentage, the points, and the threes can all return back up to a higher value this season. So I do believe compared to last year, where he was the 103rd ranked player in 9-cat, 125th player in -1, you can see, I think you can see a fairly sizable jump in rankings compared to those numbers. So when he's drafted at a spot very similar to what he put up last season, I think you've already got some inbuilt value there, even if all the other stuff remains the exact same, because I feel fairly confident that that's going to boost up this season. If we go on to the next category, so we're looking at rebounds. This is where it gets a little bit more difficult for me to be confident in this changing. So again, we're just combining all the rebounds for the starting, or the rest of the starting 5, so the other 4 players on the court. For Utah, it was 23.5 rebounds per game. For Atlanta, it was 23.5 rebounds per game. For Utah, it was 25 rebounds per game. Again, I'm using Kessler once he started for the team, so that definitely boosts those numbers up. And so sharing the court with Larry Markkinen, who had 8.6, and Walker Kessler, who had 10.2, is actually probably going to be harder for John Collins to find extra rebounds compared to Atlanta, where it was really Clint Capella dominating the boards. DeJounte Murray stole a little bit here, but then you got Hunter and Trae who weren't doing too much. Now, I will say that in Atlanta, you had Clint Capella as the starting 5, but you also had Onyeka Okongwu as the guy coming off the bench. And they dominated all 48 minutes at the center position in Atlanta when they were both healthy. Compared to Utah, you've got Walker Kessler, and then you've got someone like Kelly Olynyk probably coming off the bench. But does Olynyk get all of the minutes at the backup center compared to maybe does John Collins get some minutes playing more at center? I think there's a little bit more room that outside of the starting 5 that John Collins can pick up a few more rebounds in those situations, depending on how many minutes he gets playing at center and depending how many minutes he plays next to Kessler versus how many minutes he plays next to someone like an Olynyk or a Taylor Hendricks or one of those types of players. So whilst it's actually a negative when it comes to the starting lineups, I actually do still think there's a little bit of room for the rebounds to come back up, but I'm by no means as confident in the rebounds bouncing back as I am in the usage and field goal attempts coming back. So compared to last year, he was at 6.5 rebounds. The previous 2 seasons, he was at 7.6 combined. I think we're probably more hoping for him to get to 7. I don't know if he gets to 7.5 or 8 rebounds. I definitely don't think he's getting to 10 rebounds, which he did in 18-19 and 19-20. I don't think that's happening. But I do think that there is enough scope to believe that he can get up to 7. But I'm not ready to project him to go back up to, more than 7.5 or 8 rebounds per game. So I don't necessarily think he bounces all the way back up to the top 50 value that he was in the previous 2 seasons. But in my projections, when I add in those extra shots per game, which I believe he will get, it does boost him up to, if I just look at my projections here, and again, if you are on ballboysnba.com, you can go and check this one out again. It brings him up to be a top 70 player in 9 category settings. He isn't quite as high in a -1 setting, so do take that into account if you are someone that likes to punt and things like that. You don't value the turnovers quite as high as well. So in that kind of situation, he's probably more of a top 90 guy. Which again probably fits more around where his draft position is, but still maybe like another 10 spots higher than his ADP. If you are someone that values that total 9-cat balanced build, then I think John Collins is an extremely valuable player that is going at an extreme discount if that is what you want to choose to value. I personally don't, so I'm more targeting him around the 90 range. It's not much different. It's not much better than his ADP, but it is a little bit better than his ADP suggests. So, and in some instances, he is going quite later into the 110s sometimes because people are just kind of moving off him and going for someone who's a bit more upsidey by that point. So I do think that John Collins has an ability to bounce back this season. And again, this is just assuming that he just kind of regresses back to the mean. He is still someone that I could see, if injuries strike or something like that, he could take this even to another level. So I do think that even though I say top 70, top 90 in -1, I think there is scope for that to be the low end and for him to exceed that by another 10 to 20 ranking points at the end of the season. So I do think that he's getting slept on a little bit, and I do think that the ADP is behind where I project him to be slightly. But I don't think we should be getting carried away because, again, in a -1 setting, he really fits those punt, assists, and steals build. If you are a team trying to look after both percentages, which can be difficult to do, he helps you in both those percentages and still is able to contribute a little bit of blocks and threes and rebounds and good scoring from a power forward center eligible player. So those are all nice things without really being truly elite in any one area. But that will about do it for us today for John Collins, who was number 2. Let me know down in the comments, guys, where are you targeting John Collins? Do you think he's someone that you're going to get in many of your drafts, or is he a bit boring for your fantasy team? I can definitely see that side of the coin, but there is a place for John Collins to get drafted in a lot of spots because I do think, again, we've seen him as a top 10 player before. I don't expect that to happen, but again, I wouldn't say it would be impossible for us to see that happen if he does really just take to this new situation, much like Larry Markkinen did last season. So I do think he is being underrated. But let's talk about number 21, who is coming up next season. So I'm loving you guys guessing in the comment section down below, guys. Go ahead and shoot your guess down. But I'm going to give you guys a hint. Number 21 is a guy that I have talked about on a previous podcast, saying that he is a breakout candidate. But I think that people are getting too high on him and his ADP data is going too high. So I've also put him on a bust video as well. That's a pretty easy clue. I reckon a lot of you will get that one. So this player has appeared on a breakout video and on a bust video so far this season, but we're going to discuss him in detail and figure out which is it. Is he a bust? Is he a breakout? Could he be both? But we'll see you guys next time, and tomorrow, catch us then. Bye.